I hope everyone had a great break. So for week 8, we're going to be talking about human-centered design. So first of all, for some announcements, we have homework. Homework 7 will be released today. And then our final project spec is also out. So the check-in, so for your final project, you'll basically be making your own website on anything that you want. And the check-in will be due April 15th, and the project will be due on April 27th at midnight. And also your project can be possibly featured on our showcase website, which you can explore in your own time to see some of the best websites that each semester has created. Yeah, and then this is the submission link for your final project. So getting into today's design lecture, we're going to be talking about human-centered design. If you remember in like one of the first few lectures that we had, we talked about how some different like design phrases that are kind of common or used kind of in exchange of each other. So one of them that we mentioned was human-centered design, and it basically means to design with an approach that incorporates kind of like a human perspective. So designing for what makes what works best and what is like the most optimized solution for a human experience. So why HCD? So empathizing with others and understanding how humans work can help us design things that are usually that are really useful and effective. And another thing is like in relation to the web design decal, you guys are building websites, and the people who are like using these websites are, well, people. So that's why you really want to get an understanding of human-centered design to kind of understand how to really design for the people that you want to view your website. So the human-centered design process generally follows some format of going from like analysis to design to evaluation to implementation. So analysis usually involves like user research and defining the problem space. So first you want to validate that your problem is, an actual problem. And then you want to do user research. So you want to really understand what your users' needs are, how they interact with whatever you're designing for. So in this case, if you're designing a website, you want to understand how users interact with websites. The next step would be ideation. So this is when you're going to take all the insights that you've drawn from your research and kind of start coming up with ideas and brainstorming and creating prototypes, low fidelity, mid fidelity, and high fidelity prototypes to really kind of flesh out your ideas and design solutions based off of your research. And then the next step would be evaluation. So you want to make sure that your solutions are actually what people need. So what you're going to do is user testing. So you're going to want to test the solutions that you've come up with, the prototypes that you've come up with, and have people interact with them and play around with them to get feedback on whether they're kind of successful in solving the problems that you aim to solve. And then lastly would be implementation, which is fleshing out like a high fidelity prototype and really kind of coming up with a finalized solution. And if you noticed, there's like arrows going back and forth between each step. So this isn't really a linear process. I know it's displayed that way from kind of like left to right. In most diagrams about HCD design, you'll see it that way, but it's really more of like an iterative process. So you might be at the design stage and make a low fidelity prototype. And then once you get to user testing, realize like it's not the move and that there's a lot of issues with it. So you go back to design and design something new. So there's a lot of iteration happening and the process is by no means linear. Yeah, so kind of going deeper into what each segment does and means. So for user research, there's a lot of different methods. You can do interviews, which kind of gives anecdotes and first-person experiences of like the people that you're focusing on. You could also do surveys, which are generally less in depth than interviews, but they can give you a wider kind of range of results and really allow you to get like a lot of people to respond. Another thing is card sorting, which is observing the users and reflecting on their experiences by grouping ideas. Um, and desk research, which is more of just like reading and studying and kind of secondary research like articles, and ethnographic research, which is kind of observation. So if you're observing a person, like for example, in a space or using a particular device or interacting with a website or application to just kind of really understand their behavior. So your goal with user research is to kind of understand the user's behavior when they're interacting with like whatever you're designing for in like the current space, and to also kind of understand what current type of problems and need like that the users are facing and what needs they have. So when designing from a human-centered design approach, there's kind of three really important things to keep in mind. One is empathy, like you really want to be empathetic of others, you want to be understanding of their needs. The world does not revolve around you, so you like just because you might think something is an issue doesn't mean it like is a general issue or is like a widely agreed upon issue. So you really want to kind of have an understanding and be able to put yourself into other people's shoes to understand their perspective and their approach. Second is neutrality. So kind of like what I mentioned before, you don't want your own biases and understandings to overshadow like the research you've done. So for example, like if you're working on something, you might have your own perceptions or your own kind of problems with whatever you're working on, but you want to make your decisions based off of your research and not necessarily like your biases. And then three is simplicity. It's kind of sometimes I think when the word design comes to mind, a lot of, you think about like aesthetics or like visuals, but simple is really best. You want to make sure that, like while it's nice to have nice visuals, the main point of design is like the functionality. So you want to make sure the user doesn't get lost with unnecessary kind of like functions or design things going on, and that they can really kind of perform and do the things that the design is meant to do. So in the case of like your websites, like um, while it's nice to have kind of visual components, you don't want it to overpower kind of the um, what the user is like intended to do on your website. So don't add too many things that could be like distracting or unnecessary. So when kind of designing for these spaces, you really want to define the problem. So a common approach is to create a how might we statement to kind of frame your problem and really understand what you're designing for. And then for ideation, you're really going to start ideating after you synthesize your findings. So um, there are like one thing you can look at is if there are clear groups of users with similar experiences. And then based off that, you can make personas, which are kind of characters representing each group and kind of the most common like things that you've like discovered in your research. So personas are kind of like these kind of snapshots and overviews of these people that you've like created that kind of represent the most important parts of your research. Um, so generally it'll have kind of like a background about the person, like the type of person, depending on obviously like what your problem space is, it can vary. You want to make it relevant to your project. But there will be like main demographic things, kind of like age and maybe, for example, like this one says like their job title. If that's like relevant to the project, you want to include that. And then the main focuses are kind of their background and also what their pain points and needs are. So their pain points would kind of be the issues that they're having, like what essentially like when they experience pain throughout like this process of them using a product. So the issues that they've been having and things like that. And then the needs would be kind of what they want from like this experience. So for example, like if the things you're like designing for, if they want like a certain thing incorporated, if, for example, including this would make like their experience easier or like more flawless. It's kind of like that. So essentially to kind of really narrow down and focus on kind of the main takeaways from your research, you're going to want to create personas to kind of personify the and kind of make it in a way. It's kind of personas are used to make like things more relatable and like have people be more empathetic because you're creating kind of like a persona for this person that hypothetically like doesn't exist, drawn from like your main insights. And then if there's like a clear process that users seem to follow, a journey map can be helpful to kind of illustrate and visually display that process. So if here's an example of a customer journey map of switching mobile plans. So the main steps throughout this process would be to define, so that's reviewing like the current plan, and then comparing different plans would be the next step, and then negotiating for the best offer would be the next step, and then the last one would be kind of selecting the plan they choose to go with. So by creating a journey map, you kind of define and mark out each step, which is kind of what these would be, like the boxes highlighted in blue and green. And then if you see this little like squiggly line, it's to kind of indicate the mood of the user throughout the process. So for example, like negotiating is difficult. So that's kind of like an annoying thing to do or like an irritating thing to do. And then like, for example, comparing is something that's easier. So it kind of, you can kind of draw out and reflect kind of how they feel throughout this entire process as well. And through this and personas, you can kind of help identify different opportunities that you can help design for, and certain needs that you want to like target and address. For example, like if, for example, like negotiating is kind of like the dip of this like curve, right? So clearly there's issues with negotiating, and that can be something that could be possibly improved upon. Yeah, and then also to take in key insights and narrow down ideas, a good thing to do is to infinity map, which is kind of grouping ideas together and drawing observations from it. So this is kind of like, yeah, so this is kind of like a wall of sticky notes. So essentially it's kind of taking ideas that are similar or fall into certain categories. So if you look, you'll see like these green post-it notes that seem to kind of, and red, that seem to indicate larger categories. And then whatever ideas or like insights that you've drawn from your research, if they kind of align with a certain category, you can put it into that category. So you'll kind of form all these different groups, and essentially it makes it easier to kind of navigate the research that you've done, and kind of look for kind of main takeaways and commonalities, and also kind of help show you which areas maybe need the most focus when kind of moving forward to ideating. For example, if like an area that has like a bunch of sticky notes underneath it, like that's probably an area that needs more attention compared to maybe like a topic that maybe has like one sticky note grouped under it after you've done your affinity mapping. So it really helps kind of show, like, I think of it as kind of like almost like a heat map type of thing. Basically like the larger concentration of post-it notes, there's kind of more concerns within that fall within that area, and then are more insights and takeaways within that area, and is probably like a greater concern. It also just helps you kind of in general just sort out your thoughts. Yeah, so overall rules of thumb, be empathetic. The user's needs are the most important. That trumps your own biases, what you could possibly think is cool or like needed for the design. To be observant, and notice repetition and trends, kind of like what I mentioned before. If you have like lots of key insights that fall under a certain category, those might be more important. It's also very important to consider edge cases as well, because not every user, completely falls within maybe that kind of main concern group. And then emotions as well. And then be open, think about things that you haven't considered. The design process is kind of like never finished really, like there's no kind of flawless solution. So be open to like things that you haven't thought about, whether it be like ideas or different viewpoints that you might have not like researched or gained access to research. And then also be inclusive, think about accessibility, think about groups of people that you might not have included into like your research. Yeah, and then moving forward to user testing. So there's a lot of different methods for user testing. If you want random quick user testing, you can use guerrilla testing, which is like essentially going up to random people in public and asking them to test your product. Not very safe for COVID times, would not recommend that right now. I think there are some websites that you can use for user testing. And then for more in-depth personal testing, you can use contextual inquiry, just like questions, and then moderated usability tests, which are like supervised tasks. So you can ask someone to perform something. For example, like if we're talking about a website, you can be like, hey, how would you navigate to maybe like the menu or like the about page, and see how they perform that task to understand if they're able to perform it, or if they have issues, if it's hard to navigate to maybe like the about page and things like that. For larger scale testing, you can use unmoderated or remote usability tests, which is kind of unsupervised tasks and feedback. So another way to kind of like explain that is you could get people to kind of just, so you not without instructions, kind of like explore your page and then give kind of like their overall feedback. Yeah, and then for prototyping and fabrication, oh wait, why is it not going back? Okay, so that's just kind of the last step. To do user testing, you probably developed like low or high fidelity, or not high fidelity, like low or mid fidelity prototypes. But the end is when you'll kind of build your high fidelity prototype. And this is kind of keeping in mind everything you've done up until this process. So this is keeping in mind the research you've done, like the feedback that you've gotten from user testing on like your low and mid fidelity prototypes, and just keeping in mind really overall everything that you've done, especially your research in mind. And after iterating, this is kind of like your final iteration off of all like the past kind of steps that you've done. So yeah, and after kind of taking in all the insights from the previous steps, this is when you'll create like your high fidelity prototype. And then I think this takes you to this at the bottom takes you to like a link where it kind of goes more in depth about the whole like design process. Yeah, so you're really iterating for optimization. You really want your final product or solution or whatever it is to be the most optimized for your user and really address all the user needs and concerns that your user has. Yeah, so this is just like an overall look at the whole process again. And that's it for the design portion.
Hi, so we're going to start the programming lecture now. Okay, so today we're going to talk about an introduction to JavaScript. So this is kind of like our next big module that we're going to cover in this course in terms of programming. So far we've learned about HTML and CSS, and today we're going to go into JavaScript, which is responsible for the function part of your website. So these are some questions that we're going to cover in this lecture. First, we're going to address what exactly is JavaScript, and then we're going to go into some examples that show what we can exactly do with JavaScript in our websites, and then what does it look like in terms of the code and the syntax, and then at the end, we'll go over some hands-on basics. So what is JavaScript? JavaScript is basically a programming language, and some people want to distinguish between a scripting language and a programming language. But yeah, JavaScript is a programming language, which means that it's a lot more powerful than languages such as HTML and CSS. And it's completely different from HTML and CSS, and also Java, which a lot of people, when they start out programming, they get confused between Java and JavaScript, but they're in fact two different languages. Even though it is a programming language, don't be scared by JavaScript. We're going to walk you through all the basics of it, and we'll give you a lot of guidance throughout your process of learning the language. So you don't have to like fret or be terrified of this like more coding language. And yeah, so just like we wrote HTML and CSS to tell the browser what we want things to look like, we're going to write JavaScript to tell the browser what we want those things to do. So far we've kind of just went over like, I guess, how to make things look like the way we want them to, but now we're going to do how we want, or we're going to code the way we want the things to do, the things that we want them to do, if that makes sense. So it's more like the appearance before, but now it's more about the behavior. So what can we do with it? Our goal is to write JavaScript code that will add interactivity to our pages. Specifically, JavaScript can change our existing HTML and CSS. So far, all your web pages that you've designed so far are like very static pages. So everything you see there, like as soon as you reload the page, it's not going to change much, with the exception of like if you use CSS animations, then you'll have like some basic, I guess, user interaction embedded in your web page. But otherwise, there's not a lot of dynamic behavior going on. So some examples of what we can do with JavaScript include pop-up dialogues, image carousels. Anytime you see something that can be expanded or hidden, such as drop-down menus, those can all be implemented with JavaScript. And JavaScript is kind of unique in that it's both a front-end language and a back-end language. But for the sake of this course, we're only going to cover how it functions as a front-end language. So we're not going to go into detail about how it works on the back-end side, but it is used in a lot of frameworks such as React and Angular as like the core language that they use for building like more, I guess, complex websites, but we're not going to cover that in this course. In thinking about this interactive functionality, we can think of it as like a feature that we want to add to our web page. So for example, like a user might click on a button or a link or an image, and we want to do something dynamic to that content. So we might want to add, change, or remove a certain HTML element, or add, change, and remove a CSS style. So when you're coding in JavaScript, always think about what you want to accomplish before you start coding. And now we'll walk through some examples of what you can do with JavaScript. So as I said before, like for example, when a user clicks on an image, it can increase in size, and we can do this with JavaScript. And increasing in size means like changing the CSS width property. On the other hand, the user might click on a button and then change the colors to dark mode. And changing colors to dark mode might mean changing the CSS color and the background color. When the user clicks on a tab, they want to change the content that the user sees on the web page. And that could mean hiding the first div element and then showing the second div element. And like if you want to go into more detail about how this works, you basically set display none to the first div and then set display block to the second div. Another example is when the user clicks on the up arrow and it increases like a certain number that you might see like on the web page. And increase in a number is basically you're taking like whatever number that is currently shown inside a div element and then adding 1 to that number, and then the div will like update with the new value of that number. So JavaScript's role in the web page, basically when we write HTML, it just shows up when we open the HTML file, and then when we write CSS, it shows up if there were CSS selectors that refer to those specific elements on the HTML page. But in terms of JavaScript, it's not going to just like show up on the page unless we tell it to modify HTML and CSS. There's a lot of things that you can do like behind the scenes that won't necessarily like come up on the screen. So it's a little more tricky, especially when it comes to like debugging things and like when you're trying to figure out what's wrong. It's harder to tell if things are working properly if you're not immediately showing the results of that on your website. And so there's a very useful tool that we're going to cover later on in this lecture, which is the console. And so in Chrome DevTools, there's a tab called console. You may have noticed this when you're doing inspect element, but the console is a really useful tool that you should use when you're trying to debug something in your JavaScript code, because there's a lot of things that don't usually show up on your page. And so you want to print out like basically anything that you want to like check the value of, or like make sure that a function is being called correctly, etc. And you do that all within the console. Okay, so having said that, how do we try this out? We actually use JavaScript. So you can create a new file and call it script.js and put it in the folder of your website. And similar to how we like link the style sheet in CSS to our HTML page, we can also do the same thing with these JavaScript files. So the syntax for this is basically script source equals, and then you put the file path, and always make sure that the file path is correct. Otherwise, your JavaScript file won't be loaded correctly in your web page. And then again, make sure that there's a closing tag for the script tag as well. Before we usually say like put the script tag in your like head tags, but because you usually want to wait until your document or your HTML page is fully loaded before you start acting on those elements, we prefer putting that at the end of the body tag instead, so that you make sure that all of the elements in the HTML are loaded first, and then you can insert the script in so that the functions that you have in your script can run after those elements are loaded. Because you might run into problems where like you insert the script and then it runs before any of the elements are properly loaded, and so like it will throw a bunch of errors and say that like this element doesn't exist, for example. So in order to avoid that problem, it's best practice to put it at the end of your body tag in your HTML file. So we're going to cover a couple of basic concepts in JavaScript today, including variables, how to use the console, as I said before, and we're also going to introduce like a fun function called alert, which you can also use in your browser. And then we'll also go into more detail about strings and functions, which are kind of like essentials in JavaScript. And the goal is to be able to read basic syntax in JavaScript and do some like simple math and like other functionality. So first and foremost, we have to talk about variables. Variables basically like hold all the data and all like the things that you want to do in JavaScript. And variables are called variables because they're very similar to the kind of variables that we see in math. We use a variable when we want to store the value of something and give it a name. For example, here we do let name equals Joe and then let age equals 20. So the keyword let means that we're creating a variable that is block scoped. I'm going to go into more detail about what this exactly means, but for now, just know that like you use let to declare this variable. The name is basically what you see right after let. So the first variable name is name, and then the second variable name is age. And when you're coding, make sure to make your names as meaningful as possible, because when you get a lot of variables in your file and you get confused about like which variables correspond to what kind of value, it's easier when you have names that like make more sense and like are intuitive to you and also potentially other people in the future. Yeah, and they're usually like a noun. And then lastly, the green text is the actual value that you assign to the variable. And here you can see that name is a string value and age is an integer value. So we're going to also cover more in detail about like what strings are, but basically string is like a phrase or a sentence, anything that contains characters or letters, and you can like put them together into like a string. And remember, if you're storing text, it must be in quotes, because otherwise, if you just put like JOE without quotes, it's not going to know that it's a string and it will throw an error. Now going more in depth about variable scoping. So there's 3 different types of, I guess, keywords that people use to declare variables, and they are var, let, and const. And so, yeah, each of these like keywords have different types of variable scoping, and you might be wondering like, what exactly is a scope? So each variable has its own scope, and it's basically a global or local environment in which it holds a defined value. So in this example that you see below, we have like var name equals Joe at the very top. And so that means that it's defined globally. So it's outside any of the functions that you might have in your HTML, or sorry, not in your HTML file, in your JavaScript file. On the other hand, you have this variable called friend, and it's declared locally. So that means that it's declared within a function. So you can see that there's a function called foo, and within that you have a variable called friend. So var is a little complicated because it can be used like it can be declared globally and locally, which can run into a lot of problems. But before that, just to like kind of clarify what the difference is between global and local. So if we try to access the variable friend outside of the scope of this function, so like after the end of this curly brace, it will throw an error because friend is not defined. So basically, when a variable is defined locally within a function, that means it only exists within that function. So if you try to access that variable outside of the function, it's not going to be defined. So it's not going to exist. What if we define var name again? So inside this function, we say var name equals Tim. And you might be wondering like, oh, we already defined like var name equals Joe outside. Like, what is this doing? So this is where var gets kind of confusing because here, if you redefine the variable name inside the function, the global variable name will also be changed to Tim, even though you might think that like, oh, the second variable name is like defined locally, so like it should only exist locally, right? But because you use var, and like the way var works is that if you define it with the same name, then like it's going to change the global one too. Anyway, this gets kind of complicated, but yeah, some people like might run into problems with this, so we just want you guys to know about it. The preferred variable scoping method is to use let, and let is block scope. So anything within a chunk of code that is bounded by curly braces is a block. And so, yeah, let me just quickly go over this because variable scoping is a little more complex, and like, I think most of this stuff you guys haven't seen before, so I don't want to like go too much into detail about it. But yeah, I guess the short way to explain this is that similar to what we did before, except for replacing all of the vars with lets, like if we access the variable name outside of the scope of the function, it will return Joe instead of Tim. So basically this name only exists within the function scope, and then this will also stay the same as Joe instead of changing to Tim. And then the last one is constant, which is also block scoped, but the only difference is that it can't be updated in value or redeclared. So yeah, just make sure you don't ever like declare a constant and then like try to change the value later. Okay, sorry, that was kind of a lot of info, but let me move on to talking about strings. So there's this really cool thing in JavaScript and most programming languages where you can do string concatenation. And concatenation is basically a fancy word that means put text together. So we can add strings, which remember, those are text that are in quotes together. So here are some examples. We can do let name equals Nicholas. Make sure you have it in quotes, and then let greeting equals howdy space plus name plus the string exclamation mark. So yeah, let's kind of break this down a little more. So here we have a string variable called name, but it has the value Nicholas. And then the greeting variable is assigned this entire value. So the way you concatenate strings in JavaScript is by using this plus symbol. So that means you want to put like all of these different strings together. So you have howdy as a string, and then you have name, which holds the value Nicholas, and then you have the exclamation mark at the end. So when you do the plus symbol in between them, that means you're combining all of them into one massive string. So greeting basically represents this entire string, which is howdy Nicholas. And here we also use another function called console.log, which, as I mentioned before, this is how you use the console in your browser. So if you ever want to like print out a value that you want to verify in your code, you can use console.log. So you can say console.log greeting. And so basically you're printing out the value of greeting in your console. And here it correctly shows that it's howdy Nicholas, which is the value of greeting. Someone asked in the chat, why didn't we just add Nicholas in the greeting variable? So yeah, I guess the whole point of using variables is that like, regardless of what this name variable has, like it could be someone else's name entirely, and we can still use this line greeting. Like basically this line, like the second line, it doesn't care about what the value of name is. It just wants to concatenate name with howdy and exclamation mark. So like name could be like, I don't know, like Howie or something, or Bianca or Julia. You can just like not worry about the value of name and just put it together with howdy and exclamation mark. So that's why we want to use the variable name instead of like the actual string itself. I hope that answered your question. Okay, moving on. So there's another function that you can use called alert. And this is a more interactive way to like verify things, I guess. It basically has this result that you see on the bottom where like there's like a pop-up that shows in your browser. So for example, if you want to verify that greeting is correctly howdy Miles, you can use alert greeting and it'll print out like howdy Miles within the popover alert. So yeah, that's just like another way to like verify things, but obviously this is not as good as console.log because like it displays itself as a pop-up and it gets kind of annoying if you have a lot of alerts, but it's just like a funner way to, I guess, do things if you want. Okay, and then yeah. This is another example of something you can do. Oh, sorry, I think this is supposed to be a question that I asked to you guys, but I kind of already showed the result. But yeah, you guys can like kind of look at this and think to yourself like what you expect to show up. And then, yeah, I've already like kind of showed the result, but it's fine. So basically, last sentence equals person plus emotion plus course plus exclamation mark. It concatenates all of these different strings together. So yeah, I think this is pretty straightforward. So I'm just going to show the result. So since person is I, emotion is love, and course is WDD, it concatenates all of them together and it shows I love WDD exclamation mark. Note that there's no space in between. Like you might expect that there should be a space, but that's because like we didn't put a space after WDD, or sorry, not WDD. We didn't put a space after I, and we didn't put a space after love. So that means when you concatenate them together, it like basically just like smushes them together. And like if you don't have a space in between, it doesn't care. Like it just smushes all of them together. So if you want to make it show correctly that there's a space in between the words, you have to put the space into the strings themselves. And now moving on to basic math. So far we kind of went into like how text works in JavaScript, but now we're going to cover how numbers work in JavaScript. So we can also do math with our variables. We have some basic arithmetic, what's it called? Like functions that you can use. So like plus, minus, asterisk, which is like multiply, slash, divide, and then percent sign, which is modulo. So here are some examples. We can do let age equals 20 plus 5. And so it recognizes that this plus is used as the add like function. So it adds 20 and 5 together. And in the second line, it reassigns the value of age and assigns it the value of 20 minus 2.5. Yeah, so that's how you like reassign a value. Like if you want to change a value with the same name, you use that same line, except you get rid of the let. And that's because the variable already exists. So make sure that like when you're trying to change a value that already exists, you don't use the let keyword again. And then the last line is basically using the multiplication symbol. So let double age equals age times 2 basically doubles the value of age. Okay, I kind of covered a lot so far, but does anyone have any questions? For age, why didn't we write 25? Yeah, that's a good question because like here, it doesn't really matter like if we do 20 plus 5 and 25 because like you're just defining the variable like initially. So like if you know it's going to be 25, you might as well write 25, right? But I think we're just trying to show that like this is how you do basic arithmetic in JavaScript. You can use like plus symbols, minus symbols, asterisks, and other like symbols as well. So yeah, you could perfectly write this just as let age equals 25, and that would be fine. Are there any other questions? Okay, if not, we can move on. So now going into functions. Functions, again, like a lot of things in JavaScript are basically kind of borrowing concepts from math. So like variables are similar to variables in math, and functions are also very similar to functions I use in math. So a function takes the values as inputs and it does something with them that outputs a value. And this is really useful if we have a piece of code that we don't want to keep writing out. So like if you have a bunch of numbers and you want to square all of them, you don't have to individually say like 1 times 1, 2 times 2, 3 times 3. You can use a function that can like simplify your code so that you can call this function on all of the numbers you want to like square, for example, and that prevents you from rewriting the same code over and over again. So let's kind of like dissect the anatomy of how a function looks like in code. So the keyword function tells us that we're defining a function. And then the square is the name of the function. And again, similar with variables, you want to make the name of the function meaningful so that you remember like what it does when you're referring to it like later on in your code. And while variables are usually a noun, not squares, functions are usually a verb. And then we have parentheses after the name, and that lets you know that this is like a function and that it's taking in some parameters. And so these are the function parameters or arguments that it takes. And here you can see that within the parentheses, we have x. So that's the parameter or the argument that goes into the function. So yeah, this is really important to remember, like just the general syntax of the function. A lot of people get confused with like the syntax, like they forget to put parentheses, they forget to put the parameters in, they forget like the function keyword at the beginning, all sorts of things. So just remember that this is the general syntax that you have to use when you're declaring a function. And then inside the curly braces, you have what you want to do with the function. So for example, here we're trying to square the value of x, so we return x times x. And the function usually does something with the parameters. Return means that you want to return the final output value. And it might be unclear to you like what this return really means, but when you're working with functions, like if you want to print out the value of square x, for example, or like square 5, you can just put that inside like console.log, and then like the function square will return the correct value, which is like 25 if we're using square 5, and then it will print that value out in the console. So it will print 25. But returning basically tells the user that like that's the value that you want to ultimately give back to whatever you're calling the function from. So how do we use functions? This is kind of like an example of like what I kind of already mentioned in the previous slide. So you have like this function square, and then you let the result equals x times x, and then you return that result. And here at the bottom, we're actually calling the function. And this is also something that you have to remember when you're using functions. Like one is how you define the function, and two is how you call the function. And so the function is pretty much useless if you don't call it. Like if you don't ever use the function, then like it's never going to be used within your script file. So these two lines at the bottom is how you call the function. So when you say let y equals square 5, that basically tells like the compiler that your parameter x is the value of 5. And so you're kind of like passing in the value of 5 into the function square as x. And then when this part runs, let result equals x times x, it basically multiplies 5 by 5. And then it returns the number 25. And so when you return it, it basically comes back outside the function to this line that we called it from, and then it assigns the value of 25 to y. So that's basically how like function calling works. So like remember you have to include parentheses in front of the parameters so that you let the code know that like 5 is the value that you want to pass in as x. And then you can kind of just think of it as like you're passing in 5, you're doing something to 5, and you're returning 5, or not, you're returning the whatever you do to 5, like the result of that, to the value of y. And then similarly here in the next line, when you do square y, it takes the value of y, which is 25, and so it passes in 25 as the parameter, and it multiplies it by itself, and it returns 125. So z is now equal to 125. So that's the basic process of how like function calling works and like how you pass arguments or parameters into functions. Are there any questions about this specifically? Okay, I'll move on then. And okay, so all of the functions we covered so far involve returning a value, but you don't have to return a value. For example, if you want to like print something in the console, or if you want to show an alert in your browser, you don't have to return anything. You can just call that function within like the function you define. So here we have function show greeting with the parameter name. So we're passing in some like arbitrary value as the variable name inside this function. And then we use this variable name to concatenate it with this howdy and exclamation mark string. And we make that greeting. And then we call alert on greeting. So if you recall, this basically just shows the pop-up in your browser and it says howdy Miles. And this is because when we actually call the function below, we pass in the string miles as the name parameter in this function, and then it concatenates it, and then it gives us the value of greeting, which is howdy Miles. So here's an example of just like a function that doesn't return anything, but it still has some like visible output. In JavaScript and a lot of other programming languages, you can use comments, and comments are really useful, especially when you're writing like a lot of code and you want to let yourself know like what different parts of your code actually mean and like what they do. So yeah, similar to like HTML and CSS, like it's really useful to be able to write these comments because sometimes you might forget like what a function does or like what these variables mean. So writing comments will kind of remind you and like refresh you on like what you've done in the past. So for example, here we have like a comment that tells us like what show greeting does. And so it tells us that it takes the string name and it shows an alert. And in JavaScript, comments are denoted as the // symbol, which is, I believe, the same as in CSS. So yeah, you can use comments the same way in JavaScript as you do in CSS. And then likewise, also similar to what we do in CSS, you can do multiple line comments, which is by using the slash and the asterisk. Okay, so lastly, we have this final like exercise for you guys to like try out on your own to see like if you guys can figure out what the correct output is. So basically we have this function. It's called do something and it takes in two parameters, course and num. And then it does some sort of like magic on those two values and it returns a result. And then finally here on the outside, we have the function calling. So we have do something with WDD as a string and then 10 as a number. And you guys can like take a few minutes or so to think of what this function outputs. And then feel free to type your answer in the chat. Okay, I see some answers. Makes WDD easy. Yeah, okay, so I think you guys got it right. So let me just like kind of walk through like how the process looks like. So here we're calling do something with the string WDD and the number 10. So that basically directly corresponds to these parameters that we have here in the function declaration. So the course takes the value of WDD as a string, and then num takes the value of 10. So inside this function now, we have num equals num plus 90. So as we said before, num is the value of 10, and so we're doing 10. Okay, don't think about it that way, but like num is the variable, and you're assigning num to this new value, which is num plus 90, and num is 10. So you're assigning num to the value of 10 plus 90, which is 100. This is a bit tricky because I think people get a little confused about how this works because you're like, oh, num equals num plus 90, but you can't add it to yourself. But basically just like think of these things as like separate. So like num is the variable and it doesn't matter what that is. You're just assigning the value of the right side to num. And the value on the right side is num plus 90 and num is 10. So it's 10 plus 90, which is 100. So at the end of this line, num is 100. And then the second line, we have let res equals I have taken as a string concatenated with course plus another string and then plus num and then plus times. So here you're basically doing a very long string concatenation. So you're taking course, which is WDD, putting that in the middle, and then num, which is now 100, putting that in the middle as well. And at the end, you have I have taken space WDD, all lowercase because that's what we passed in, and then 100 times. So yeah, does that make sense to you guys? Like, I guess the way we passed in the parameters and how we manipulated those values and ultimately returned that end string result. Okay, if there's no further questions, I think this is the end of the lecture.